Well, a very good evening to you once again. Now, calls have been growing in Africa for the restitution of its cultural treasures, but French laws strictly forbids the government from giving up state property. Now, this issue was put in the spotlight in 2016 when President Patric Talon of Benin asked France to return its items, including carvings, sceptres and sacred doors from the Palaces of Abomey. Now, experts appointed by President Emmanuel Macron will advise him to allow the return of thousands of African artworks held in French museums. Now, this is seen as a radical shift in policy which could put pressure on other former colonial powers. Now, to discuss this further, I'm joined by cultural expert Professor Pitika Ntuli. Ndati, thank you so much for your time this evening. Thank you for coming through. Quite a shift, I must say, you know, where we ask ourselves as Africans, how is it that we have these precious treasures in museums across the oceans and not much of that on our African continent?
Yeah, but remember that we were colonized because we were barbaric and savage, because we worship idols. Yeah. And those idols are the ones that they actually stole, that over 1,000 years ago, those works of art are still very valid you know, today, and they really affirm, you know, our own, very being. I think it's very, very, very progressive for the President of France to appoint, you know, those people to say France cannot live with a bad conscience after what they've done. Yeah.
How important is this for us, I guess, you know, as Africans, in having some of those treasures that tell the story of what happened to us and perhaps how we could move forward as those who were colonized, if those treasures are brought back onto African soil, to tell our children about perhaps looking at those sculptures and those precious treasures to say, this is what was taken from us and what has been returned?
Yeah, I think that would be a very, 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 very progressive thing, because remember that colonialism, the first thing that colonialism does is to disrupt the people's culture, disrupt their language, disrupt everything in order to effect a total domination. So they denied that we were, you know, artists, but our works are all over, you know, the world, you don't name it, and in their thousands. Some of the people have got about 120 African artifacts because they wanted to wipe us, you know, totally, you know, out. And when those works actually come out, then our children then are going to really realize how much of geniuses we have been, how many stories are contained in those artworks, what skills are contained in those, you know, artworks. This brings up into light. Right here in South Africa, there were those Lichtenberg heads that were done 500 BC. That is now. There are those that are hidden even here somewhere in Pretoria, you know, from Mapungu. There are stuff like Adam's calendar, the oldest megalith in the world, that has been in there for over maybe 75, you know, thousands of years. That's part of our own history, and that's a history we do not actually know about. So bringing these works of art, then it is going to allow people from Ghana to visit Senegal, from South Africa, to look at these works, because some of the works are displayed brilliantly in there, but others are held in certain, you know, catacombs.
I guess, Prof, this would also be a victory in terms of ensuring that the history of the African continent, what happened on the African continent, whether it be in Senegal or in South Africa, would be able to, the legacy or what happened then would be able to be told for generations to come undistorted.
Yeah, undistorted. You see, what happened is that now when those works of art comes out, you are going to find that figuratively the most realistic pieces of work were done in Africa before Europe has. You look at the works of Ife. Yeah. Cubism that Picasso is so well known about comes from the very masks that we are going to see. Expressionism, Surrealism, all their main you know, art movements are going to be contained. I think the museum in New York, I forget exactly which one, the Museum of Modern Art, produced 2 coffee table books where they showed the African works of art owned by Matisse, owned by Picasso, owned by, by everybody else, and how they influenced the works of art that today are sold for about 80 million American dollars, copied from African works of art. Whereas here in Africa, like say me and my young guys from Alexander, making 23 more than life-size stone sculptures telling our history in stone. Do you think anybody in South Africa, from the corporate to government to anybody else, are even interested? But I know for a fact that we die. 800 from now, the great-grandchildren are going to demand those things to come back, because they might end up in America. That's exactly the problem with Africa.
Why has it taken so long? Well, I guess, Africa, the continent, is going through its own challenges. And now, because we've got, I guess, prominent figures and their calls for these, the restitution of these cultural treasures on the African continent, why has it taken so long for this to happen? Why are we only seeing growing calls now? Or has it always been there?
What has actually happened is that the people who rule, Africa, have got no sense of what Africa is all about. They are carrying that kind of a colonial, mind, on them. 2 years ago, we were looking at Africa Agenda 2063, about how 2063 Africa is going to be like. Do you believe me when I tell you that in there were only about 2 or 3 paragraphs about art? It was Simpiwe Dana who spoke to Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma when she was the president. Then they invited us. We put the question of the return of the works of art onto the agenda, of the AU, which was not there. You look at ourselves here. The National Development Program for 20 years, that is in it. How many paragraphs are there on art and culture? They are not. And yet everybody in the world knows that art and culture are African thing. What whole of America is African Americans who have given them that kind of a culture. And yet we, on the continent in here, we are still so backward, so much lack vision that it makes me...
Why do we fail to recognize the part that the arts has played in so many facets of society? I mean, one could possibly argue that even during apartheid, to create awareness, you had people who used the arts, whether it was music as well, to talk about the suffering of black people in South Africa. So why not respect something that played its own part, whether it was through sculpture or through music? Why is it not respected?
What has actually happened is that many people believe that we are liberated. We are not liberated by MK or APLA or the Black Consciousness Movement. They did very good work. They harassed everybody.
Undoubtedly.
But the real liberation of us, it was the work of the artists who went abroad to America, to the UK, convinced the local people of that place to convince their own government to do something. Poetry was what was done, paintings, sculptures, music. Wherever you really went, the people knew what was happening in South Africa through the arts. But ultimately, when you look at the funding formula for our own kind of government, the lowest funded thing, it is the arts. And yet we say nation building, we say social cohesion, we are saying let's form us. You cannot do all of those things outside the very spectrum of culture. Culture, in my language, is amasiko. Amasiko, from ukusigelela, to protect. Even if in our language you don't even understand that, how do you expect that those people who are sitting in offices of power...
Do you think then we perhaps have ourselves to blame today for not putting much emphasis on that, given all that you've said, putting enough emphasis on what the arts has done? If we look at what we're talking about, restitution and the bringing back of those cultural treasures, if we don't have respect for the arts now, then what respect would we gain by even having our own history brought back from abroad into our own museums here in Africa?
Now, Griselda, if at all we blame those people, we ourselves would be very stupid. You don't blame a person that is being captured, because they are not even going to begin to understand. I'll just give one very quick example. Some powerful person came over in to see our studios and said, "Oh no, God, these things are so abstract. People are not going to do that." 3 weeks after that, we had 3 to 5 year old children, 40 of them. When we ran our own workshops on them, they were interpreting the statue of Winnie that we're actually doing. This woman loves her children, she's holding her children, and she's having a feast like this. They want to take the children from her, they want to bump them. A 4-year-old are going to sit around and interpret those things, and yet the very powerful people don't. So, I mean, I wouldn't just actually blame them. I would just simply say we are damaged goods.
Prof, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for your time. Always a pleasure speaking to you. And I hope we can speak to each other again once this process perhaps reaches some kind of finality. Thank you so much, Professor Pitika Ntuli, speaking to us about growing calls, of course, in Africa for the restitution of our cultural art.